Good afternoon, class 4. Hope you're all okay. So yesterday we started reading Stig of the Dump and we got halfway through the first chapter, The Ground Gives Way. And we left it at quite a cliffhanger, didn't we? When there was something or somebody that Barney had seen in the cave that he had landed in at the bottom of the dump. Let's see what happens. Something or somebody had a lot of shaggy black hair and two black bright eyes that were looking very hard at Barney. "Hello," said Barney. Something said nothing. "I fell down the cliff," said Barney. Somebody grunted. "My name's Barney." Something made a noise that sounded like Stig. "Do you think you could help me undo my feet, Mr. Stig?" asked Barney politely. "I've got a pocket knife," he added, remembering that he had had it in his pocket, a knife he'd found amongst the wood shavings on the floor of his grandfather's workshop. It was quite a good knife, except that one blade had come off and the other one was broken in half and rather blunt. "Good thing I put it in my pocket," he thought. He wriggled so he could reach the knife and managed to open the rusty half blade. He tried to reach the creepers round his legs, but found it difficult to cut creepers with a blunt knife, especially when your feet are tied above your head. The thing sitting in the corner seemed to be interested. It got up and moved towards Barney, into the light. Barney was glad to see it was somebody after all. Funny way to dress, sir, he thought. Rabbit skins round the middle, and no shoes or socks. "Oh, puff," said Barney. "I can't reach my feet. You do it, Stig." He handed the knife to Stig. Stig turned it over and felt it with his strong, hairy hands and tested the edge with a thumb. Then, instead of trying to cut the creepers, he squatted down on the ground and picked up a broken stone. "He's going to sharpen the knife," thought Barney. But no, it seemed more as if he was sharpening the stone. Using the hard knife to chip with, Stig was carefully flaking tiny splinters off the edge of the flint until he had a thin, sharp blade. Then he sprang up with 2 or 3 slashes cut through the creeper that tied Barney's feet. Barney sat up. "Golly," he said, "you are clever. I bet my grandad couldn't do that, and he's very good at making things." Stig grinned. Then he went to the back of the cave and hid the broken knife under a pile of rubbish. "My knife!" protested Barney, but Stig took no notice. Barney got up and went into the dark part of the cave. He'd never seen anything like the collection of bits and pieces, odds and ends, bric-a-brac and old brock that this Stig creature had laying about his den. There were stones and bones, fossils and bottles, skins and tins, stacks of sticks and hanks of string. There were motor car tyres, hats from old scarecrows, nuts and bolts and baubles from brass bedsteads. There was a coal scuttle full of dead electric light bulbs and a basin with rusty screws and nails in it. There was a pile of bracken and newspapers that looked as if it were used for a bed. The place looked as if it had never, ever been given a tidy up. "I wish I lived here," said Barney. Stig seemed to understand that Barney was approving of his home, and his face lit up. He took on the air of a householder, showing a visit around his property, and began pointing out some things he seemed particularly proud of. First, the plumbing. Where the water dripped through a crack in the roof of the cave, he had wedged the mudguard of a bicycle. The water ran along this, through the tube of vacuum cleaner, and into a big can with writing on it. By the side of this was a plastic football carefully cut in half, and Stig dipped up some water and offered it to Barney. Barney had swallowed a mouthful before he made out the writing on the can. It said, "Weed killer." However, the water only tasted of rust and rubber. It was dark in the back of the cave. Stig went to the front where the ashes of a fire were smoking faintly, blew on them, picked up a book that lay beside his bed, tore out a page and rolled it up, lit it at the fire, and carried it to the lamp set in a niche in the wall. As it flared up, Barney could see that it was in fact an old teapot filled with some kind of oil, and with a bootlace hanging out of it for a wick. In the light of the lamp, Stig went to the very back of the cave and began to thump the wall and point and explain something in his strange, grunting language. Barney did not understand a word, but he recognised the tone of his voice, like when grown-ups go on about. I'm thinking of tearing this down and building on here and having this done up. Stig had been digging into the wall, enlarging his cave. There was a bit of an old bed he had been using as a pick, and a baby's bath full of loose chalk to be carried away. Barney made the interested sort of noises you're supposed to make when people tell you they're going to put up plastic wallpaper with pictures of mousetraps on it. But Stig reached up to a bunch of turnips hanging from a poker stuck in the wall. He handed Barney a turnip, took one for himself, and began to eat it. Barney sat down on a bundle of old magazines, done up with string, and munched the turnip. The turnip at least was fresh, and it tasted better to him than the cream of spinach he'd hidden under his spoon at dinner time. Barney looked at Stig. Funny person to find living next door to you, he thought. Stig did not seem much bigger than himself, but he looked very strong, and his hands looked cleverer than his face. But how old was he? 10, 20, 100, 1,000? You been here long? Asked Barney. Stig grinned again. Long, he said. Long, long, long. But it sounded more like an echo, or a parrot copying somebody, than an answer to his question. I'm staying at my grandmother's house, said Barney. Stig just looked at him. Oh well, thought Barney. If he's not interested in talking, I don't mind. He stood up. I better go now, he said. Thank you for having me. Can I have my knife back, please? Stig looked blank. Knife, said Barney, and then he made cutting movements with his hand. Stig picked up the sharp-worked flint from the floor of the cave and gave it to Barney. Oh, can I have that? Exclaimed Barney. Thank you. He looked at the stone, hard and shiny, almost like a diamond and much more useful. Then he put it in his pocket and said goodbye again and went out of the low door of the shelter. It was getting late in the autumn evening, and it was already dark and gloomy in the pit. Barney knew there was a right way out at the other end of the pit, and by going a long way round, he could get back to the house. There were rustlings in the dry leaves and muffled sounds from the middle of bramble patches, but somehow Barney found he didn't mind. He felt the hard stone in his pocket and thought of Stig in his den under the cliff. He weren't likely to find anything stranger than Stig wherever he looked. And well, Stig was now his friend. When he got back to the house, his grandmother and his sister Lou were just coming in from feeding the hens. Where have you been all this time? Asked his grandmother. I went to the chalk pit, said Barney. All by yourself? Exclaimed Lou. Yes, of course, he said. And what have you been doing? His grandmother asked. Well, I fell and bumped my head. Poor old Barney, said Lou, and laughed. But it was all right, Barney went on, because I met Stig. Who's Stig? They both asked together. Well, he's a sort of boy, replied Barney. He just wears rabbit skins and lives in a cave. He gets his water through a vacuum cleaner and puts chalk in his bath. He's now my friend. Good gracious, exclaimed his grandmother. What funny friends you have, dear. He means he's been playing cavemen, Lou exclaimed helpfully. Stig's just a pretend friend, isn't he, Barney? No, he's really true, Barney protested. Of course he's true, his grandmother smiled. Now, Lou, don't tease Barney. Let's pretend Stig's a wicked wizard who lives in a cave and turns people into stone, Lou began eagerly. She was always inventing stories and games like that. No, said Barney quietly, feeling the sharp flint in his pocket. Stig's nice. He's my friend. That night, he kept the flint under his pillow and thought of Stig out there in the pit sleeping on his bed of bracken and old newspapers. He wished he lived all the time at Granny's house so that he could really get to know Stig. He had to go back the day after tomorrow. Never mind, he'd made sure that he visited Stig in the morning. And then tomorrow we will carry on with Chapter 2, Digging with Stig. So I will see you later.